Hi, everyone. This is episode 2 in our series, The Dead Sea Scrolls Prove Paul Was Rebuffed and Rejected by the 12 and James in the Early Church, because that's what the Catholic Church was hiding for 40 years and didn't want us to see. And they didn't let the scrolls get out of their hands. But Professor Eisenman, behind the scenes, went to the charity that was paying for all of that and said, hey, this is a world. This belongs to the world. It doesn't belong to the Catholic Church. Let the scholars, other than their designated picks, tell the true story. And he didn't know what was there yet, but he found what it was. The Ebion are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's recap the main points from episode 1. The first was that the first Christians were all called the Ebion. The Ebionites is a designation at first that was a common name for all Christians. This is in the Philip Schaff produced Religious Encyclopedia of Dictionary of Biblical, Historical, Doctrinal, and Practical Theology from 1891. You see there at the bottom. So this was an article by Olharn. So the best scholarship tells you the same story that we would all know, and there would be no surprise if the Dead Sea Scrolls had it, because we now know there are records and other records in there that are from the early pre-temple fall. So we know this is not a surprise. And now Eisenman exposed this beginning in the mid-1990s when he finally got control of copies of the plates of the scrolls themselves. Then what Eisenman brings up, this is it in his book, James, the Brother of Jesus, Penguin, 1998 at 156. I suggest everybody get this book. This is just a great book to tell the story that we Christians need to broadcast to other Christians, because they don't know the Dead Sea Scrolls have any Christian writings at all. And he points out that the word poor was on Paul's lips in a couple of occasions, and Paul is said to repeating what the 12 had said, please remember the poor at Jerusalem. And so Eisenman says that's a reasonable basis to conclude that Paul even knew them as the Ebion, and that's what the word Ebion means in Hebrew, poor. Next, we showed you that the congregation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, known as the Ebion, are obviously our church. And why? I'm going to read this one more time, because it's like shocking when you think of it. Many of the sectarian works of the Dead Sea are written by a group who in Hebrew call themselves the Ebionim, or Ebion the Poor. So the other thing, before I tell you what it says, is the Dead Sea Scrolls were for 40 years attributed to one group, the Essenes. But it was hard to explain, why do we have all these disparate, different doctrines and no mention of the Essenes? So it almost looked like a rabbinic group had been collecting all the disparate sects within their land of Israel, so they would have totally disparate views, and they would just keep their records there. And then the library aspect of it is clear, because you have 7 copies of Isaiah and multiple copies of all these Bibles. Why would a sect make so many copies like that, right? Well, it made sense when Gold said, hey, this isn't what you all thought it was. And in his views, now the consensus view of I would have to say, the enlightened, non-theological experts, is that Gold is right, is the library at Jerusalem in the temple was secreted out while the Romans were sieging the temple for the outside. They didn't realize the Herod's tunnel was going underneath, and was a way to go all the way to the Dead Sea with all these books to preserve them in case the Romans actually took the city. And that was a good idea. Now, 1 million people died in that siege, and in them must have been all the people who secreted the books to the Dead Sea Scroll area in Qumran. And that's the truth. And that means you can have divergent views. So it doesn't matter, if there's another group called Sons of Light, and they have a different doctrine, the Ebion. But when you look at the documents that self-identify as Ebion works, these now have this characteristic. Listen, my friends. The poor. They even describe themselves as the congregation of the poor. The poor of the Dead Sea Scrolls claims to be followers of, quote, the way, part of the, quote, new covenant, who found the, quote, Messiah, who is called the, quote, prince of the congregation, quote, and teacher of righteousness. He is gone, killed at the urging of the priests of Jerusalem. And after the departure of the Messiah, who they believed would return, the temporal leader who led the poor was called the Just One, Zadik in Hebrew. And if you know anything about James the Just, and we proved this last time, that he was always even just called the Zadik. They didn't even mention his first name, and this was reflected in early church writings that his name James was disregarded after a while, and he was just called by as name Zadik. So you have independent corroboration that a person named Zadik in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Ebion exactly matches the historical records that James Just was called a Zadik. So, and that's why he's called James the Just meaning Zadik. Zadik is the righteous one in Hebrew. Okay, and then Arrhenius mentions in his book Heresies, and that's what it was originally called, Heresies, which only means schools of thought. And matter of factly, he tells you, Arrhenius writes, the Ebionites, quote, do not recognize Paul as an apostle, but quote, make use of the gospel we have come to know through Luke, end of quote, but reject the book of Acts. So the book of Luke, we now know through scholarship, was a translation and good effort at translating the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And there's a scholar who shows that of the early church quotes, there are more verbatim translations in Luke's gospel from all those early church quotes out of the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew than there is even in the Greek Gospel of Matthew. So even Luke might be, in a sense, closer to the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And like I've said before, he clearly refutes, Jesus of Luke refutes faith alone. The seed, the believing seed on the parable of the sower, believes for a while, but in time of temptation is what? Is dried up and destroyed, basically. And then who is the saved one in the parable? Not the believer, but the one who, with a good and faithful heart, uh, took the word in his heart, followed it, and bore fruit multiple times. Not the believer who got sidetracked in temptation and fell away, became dried up and shriveled. That person is gone, yet he was a believer. So the Luke parable of the sower has got to be the most anti-Paul, anti-faith alone doctrine you can find on the planet. But I digress. Let's keep on the thing. And so clearly what we're looking at is a group that matches identically the Christian church, and the Zadig matches identically the leader or bishop of Jerusalem, James, who's killed, I think it's about 64 AD, that period of time. Furthermore, their leader, and here's another further proof. Their leader, the Zadik, is in a struggle against the spouter of lies. So this is where Paul comes into it. And they won't name his name, by the way. They'll call him the enemy, the spouter of lies, but they never name his name. So, but we will show you how you can connect the dots. Who seeks to seduce the new covenant community from following the law of Moses. The poor, the Ebion, reject the idea that Habakkuk 2 verse 4 means justification is by faith, and insist this meaning is, quote, justification by faithfulness. The DSS Ebion have two writings, both called justification by works, which reaffirm the rejection of the position of the spout of lies. And again, in the prior episode, I go through all the proof, and I show you what the proof of these things are and where you would find them if you wanted to research this. When we compare the Ebion of the Dead Sea Scrolls to what Arrhenius describes as the Ebionites, the similarities are striking. The Christian sect of Ebionites seem to match the writings of the poor, the Ebion, whose writings were found in the Dead Sea Scroll at Qumran. These Dead Sea Scrolls reflect ideas and thoughts that are unmistakably Christian. Okay, so here's where we're going to pick up on the where I left off, and I told you we're going to do this in the next episode. We're going to do this, and so I'm going to read it because it'll kick off episode 2. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls depict the trial of Paul? What is highly intriguing is a further theory of Professor Eisenman about Paul. He claims the Poor's writings in Dead Sea Scrolls speak of a trial of Paul. He says James is depicted as Paul's key antagonist in a heated confrontation where Paul spoke vigorously against James. Paul's effort was viewed as an attempt to split the group. Eisenman bases this on two Dead Sea Scroll writings. The first is the Habakkuk Pesher, a commentary on Habakkuk 2, verse 4, a favorite verse of Paul. The Dead Sea Scrolls author interprets the verse, however, to require faithfulness for salvation. The Pesher then rejects the idea that justification is without adding works to faith. I mean, just even saying it, ladies and gentlemen, that I can actually say that and point you to the book of Eisenman is just, don't you think that has to mandate, if you're a Paul follower, you've got to go get the book Eisenman, James, the brother of Jesus. Please do so. All right, and we come to the episode 2 topics, and this will be as follows. Number 1, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain evidence of a trial of Paul by the Ebion. 2, Paul is a key pillar to the validity of the Roman Catholic Church, in particular its view that the law had been abolished, the Mosaic Law. And this fact explains why Eusebius is anti-Ebion, and B, why there was suppression of the Dead Sea Scrolls by the RCC from 1947 to late 1990s, wouldn't let it out of their hands, and hired a whole bunch of scholars, or engaged or gave privileges out to these scholars who just constantly repeated the same theme, that it's an Essene sect. There's nothing to see here, and we'll give you selected portions of things, and we won't give you any commentary that even suggests these could have been the early church. All right, so let's begin with topic 1, the DSS documents, the Dead Sea Scroll documents about a trial of Paul. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls depict the trial of Paul? Well, you already quoted this. I don't want to go over it again too much, but just the first point is, the first is evidence of that is the Habakkuk Pesher. See here, a commentary on Habakkuk 2:4, a favorite verse of Paul. The DSS author interprets the verse, however, to require faithfulness for salvation. The Pesher then rejects the idea that justification is without adding works to faith. So then Eisenman is going to tie that in here. Professor Eisenman sensibly asks us, how can we credibly believe this Pesher on Habakkuk 2, verse 4, is directed at anyone else than Paul? As we shall see next, the DSS poor are up in arms about the, quote, spouter of lies who opposes the Zadik. Are we to believe it is merely coincidence? Again, the Ebion of the Dead Sea Scrolls just so happen to want to show Habakkuk 2, verse 4, one of Paul's favorite proof texts, does not stand for an idea that Paul alone is known to have espoused. Eisenman concludes we are clearly witnessing deconstruction of Paul's doctrines in the Dead Sea Scroll Ebionite materials. It is the next document found among the Dead Sea Scrolls which is the key document to identify Paul as the object of a trial by the poor, Ebionim of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This faith works discussion of the Habakkuk Pesher continues in a work by the poor entitled The Damascus Document. It says the contrary view on, quote, works, end of quote, works, justification is held by the, quote, spouter of lies, who resists the Zadik, quote, Zadik. The spouter of lies seeks to have the, quote, congregation of the new covenant, end of quote, depart from the law. A heated public confrontation occurs between the Zadik and the spouter of lies. You can find the Damascus Document in any of the many compendiums on the Dead Sea Scrolls to verify this for yourself. But hold on to your seat. Something important is about this particular document. Professor Eisenman claims the Damascus document is too uncanny a reference to Paul and James to claim it reflects a pre-Christian debate. It appears Professor Eisenman has the better case on this point as well. The Dead Sea Scrollers who initially dominated the field tried to maintain this Damascus document as a pre-Christian document. Now, keep that in mind. So after the Dead Sea Scrolls come to light, this Damascus document is going to be said to be a pre-Christian document, because that means they don't have to explain anything about its content sounding a lot like Christians, right? That's what I want you to hold on to that for a second. They did so to serve their now discredited, all-encompassing Essene theory. And just for the record, what that means is the traditional, or meaning the scholars who had exclusive access through the Roman Catholic Church from 1947 to the late 1990s, they were constantly espousing the Essene theory, and it became almost like you can't. It's like certain medical issues we have in the modern era. They become sacrosanct, and you can't even challenge them. You would be considered like an heretic. But the word Essene never appears in these epistles, and the word Ebion does. And this document, the Dead Sea Scrolls document I'll now show you, was actually discovered long prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1800s, and long prior to that, at the turn of the last century, in the early 1900s, was concluded to be a Christian document. So do you think there's any kind of bias going on about the Roman Catholic Church authorized commentators? They're never telling you there's Christian writings, the Ebion writings, in the midst of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes, that's the explanation. So let me show you that. They ignored the contrary internal evidence in the Damascus document. What am I talking about? The general scholars, the DSS scholars who initially dominated the field, they were ignoring the contrary internal evidence in the Damascus document. This is one of the very few DSS documents that was found long before the 1950s and outside the Dead Sea area. When the Damascus document was originally found in Egypt in the 1890s, its contents led preeminent historians to regard it as a Christian writing. George Margaluth of the British Museum said in 1910 and 1911 that the Damascus document was written around the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, that's 70 A.D., the destruction Jesus prophesied about, and was the work of Sadducean Christians of Damascus. Now, The only thing you can forgive him is he located in the area of Syria, Damascus, because that's where the document was found. But it just goes to prove that when you see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, in the land of Israel, or on the border of Israel, you know that now you have to adjust just one little detail is, no, it's not just from Damascus. That means we can see it was a Christian group, and now we can identify clearly who it was. And it has the Ebion, and it's talking about the Jerusalem church. And the footnote here, just if you want to look it up, and I did read this, G. Margoliouth, the Sadducean Christians of Damascus, the Athenaeum, number 4335, November 26, 1910, at pages 657 to 59, in the Expositor, volume 2, 1911, at 499 to 517. Margolis' opinion was given long before the DSS discovery at Qumran. It antedated by 40 years the premature fixation on Essenes of 200 BC as the authors of the Damascus Document. This fact proves an objective assessment of the Damascus Document would lead to a different result. One would conclude objectively it is a work of Christians known as the poor, who were zealous for the law, Zadokites, Sadducean. So just so you know, the Sadducees used the name that were zealots for the law, although they took it always too far. Well, eternal life is not mentioned specifically. Well, yeah, okay, it's in Daniel, and Jesus even says, by the way, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he says God is not the God of the dead; he's the God of the living. So it was just implied, these people are still alive. The ancestors continue to live on with God in heaven. Let's continue. Continuing here, we can also see this for ourselves. The Damascus Document identifies the community as the poor, Ebion in Hebrew. They follow the Zadik, a label which independent and reliable sources prove was the moniker of James. The enemy of the poor was Spouter of Lies, who sought to seduce the New Covenant community from following the law. The New Testament evidence strongly suggests that Paul was accused of lying about his apostleship, and Paul knew this. Now, this is key. This is going to be, you're going to see how important it is. I'm showing you this verse, 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2. Just make a note of that, mental note, or write it down. Paul says, if I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you, for the seal of mine apostleship are you in the Lord. So he's telling the Corinthians, you know what? There are other people who don't think I'm an apostle, but you believe I am, and that's all I care about, because you know from me that I'm a true apostle, because we get along, or whatever the internal evidence in their hearts are supposed to believe. Okay, but notice he says, if I be not an apostle unto others. And what did that refer to? And we're going to see Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, makes a comment in the 350s about what that meant, based on facts that everybody apparently knew as fact, but of course have been suppressed in history. But we'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to first show you what are other evidences that Paul was accused of lying in the New Testament, that you can prove that he was under siege for lying. Verse 13, the verses which are apparently veiled criticisms of Paul in the New Testament always accuse him of lying. Revelation 2, verse 2 says the ones who tell the Ephesians they are apostles but are not are liars, when Paul contradicts Jesus on the idol meat command. 1 John 2, verse 4 tells us, quote, he that says, I know him and keep not his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. So Jesus in Revelation chapter 2 makes it clear at least twice the same thing, and that's he's just repeating what was already in Acts 15. And Paul was sitting right there, and he was asking, what did the Gentiles have to do? And the decree was they had to do at least 3 food laws and not commit fornication. One of those 3 food laws was do not eat meat sacrificed to idols. Paul clearly allows it in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. We've covered that in many episodes before. Okay. Paul was apparently aware of the accusation of being a liar. He defensively insists often, quote, I lie not. You'll find that in Romans 9, verse 1, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 31, Galatians 1, verse 20. That this accusation was over his apostleship is evident in this quote from 1 Timothy 2, verse 7. I was appointed a preacher and an apostle. I speak the truth. I lie not. Why do you need to add that if everybody knows you're an apostle? It's because you know that people don't think you're an apostle. Who was that? Now let's see if we can find any evidence from the 12. Well, just so you know, this is how I first came across this piece of evidence. So just want you to know, Ambrose wrote a book, Bishop Ambrose of Milan wrote a book, a commentary on 1 Corinthians and on Galatians. And in there, he makes the following statement. This is recorded by in the book, The Writings of St. Paul, edited by Wayne Meeks and John Fitzgerald. They're both theological professors, Christians. Norton Critical Edition, 2007. And before I quote it for you, just so you know, it's from this book by Gerald Bray, published in 1999. I'll explain that to you later. I'll show it to you, actually. Here's what it said, and this is how I first caught the attention to this. So this fact, what you're going to read here, was never publicized after 1999. And the 1999 translation of this from Latin to English was the very first translation in any language of the text of Ambrose. And he, the author Bray, went along with the, I believe, misleading statement by Erasmus that, well, how do we know Ambrose really wrote it? And, as of 1500, that was written 1200 years ago. How do we know he really wrote it? Maybe it's just a person who knows how to write like Ambrose. And so let's call him Ambrose the Aster. No evidence of why that's so, unless you're all on team Paul and you knew this was in there and you don't like it. So let's try to find a way to, distance it from reality. But we can see the Dead Sea Scrolls are telling us there was a trial of Paul, and it was about issues like, obviously, what we're seeing, you're going to see in this quote. So listen to this. This is Ambrose, Bishop of Milan. Those Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle. Jewish believers, not the apostles yet, because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or to observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles, meaning other apostles of Jesus Christ, and that's implying Ambrose is accepting Paul as an apostle of Jesus Christ. Therefore, he's not anti-Paul. He's just telling us the truth about what the other apostles did. And what did the other apostles do? The other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they denied that he was an apostle. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because they had seen the signs of God's power in him. Something that was suppressed, ladies and gentlemen, for how many years that this didn't come to light? And let's take a look and how it came to light. Now, before I tell you how it came to light, I just want to show you. I went and picked up the Latin Bible version of this so I could translate it myself, just to be sure. I've received a classical language scholarship and designation for my Latin studies and translation, so I'm pretty sure I got it right. This is 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2, and it's the same, but this yellow highlighted words, this is removed. So listen to what is apparently being suppressed by Bray, which is then picked up by Meeks, and he's rebroadcasting an incomplete quotation where somebody has corrupted even the translation, so it doesn't tell you everything. At least if Bray's source Latin text should match this Patrioliae. So unless his text doesn't have it, so that's the only excuse he can have, or he just simply missed 6 words in Latin and just didn't translate them, although they're the most important words in the text. So what was left out? However, because a scandal caused them, the apostles, to withdraw themselves from him, Paul. Okay, so now read the whole thing with that in mind. The Jews who believed, I'm going to go back up, and nevertheless kept the law, denied he, Paul, was an apostle, for he was already teaching that neither the law of circumcision should be observed, nor should the Sabbath be kept. However, because a scandal caused them, the apostles, to withdraw themselves from him, Paul, due to the fact he seemed to be teaching differently than he should. Therefore, the apostle Paul was denied by them, the other apostles. But to these, the Corinthians, he was an apostle, for from them they had signs of virtue. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord, says Paul, for by preaching this, they were converted from idols to the faith of the one God. That's what Bishop Ambrose in the 350 said about this experience, and it was just said matter-of-factly by a person who was clearly pro-Paul. He was accepting himself that Paul's an apostle, but he realized the early church rejected him. So that is very reliable evidence. And just so you can see the Latin words that were missed. So I took the Latin, I put all on the right side. Here's the English translation. Here are the words that were disregarded. Propter scandalum ab ac re dissimilantibus. No reason that you could miss that, I don't think. Then in Galatians 2:11, the commentary by Ambrose refers to what that scandal was. Something happened which caused the apostles to fall out with each other. And he's referring to, in this Galatians 2:11 passage, the whole context of Galatians 2. In fact, Paul says, I dressed down Peter and called him a hypocrite to his face because he was not eating with the Gentiles. And of course, that's all Paul's side of the story. But on the Ebionite side, the Clementine homilies record that it was because Paul was eating meat sacrificed to idols. So that would make sense. Jesus says, you should not partake of a table that's been prepared for the demons. And so that's exactly what this food was. And it doesn't have to be at the temple. It's even anywhere it's eaten. Go look at Prophet Daniel. He refused. He asked permission. I do not want to eat the meat sacrificed to idols on the king's table. I would like to eat just vegetables, if you don't mind. And rather than being weak in faith, as Paul would say, he is weak in faith in Romans 14 for just eating vegetables rather than eating meat sacrificed to idols. That was, but in context, what I'm saying is Daniel was refusing to eat just simply meat that was served at the table, not that he was forced to go to the sacrifice altar and eat, at the sacrifice altar. That wasn't the issue. And so it was very clear that it's just simply eating meat sacrificed to idols on the dinner plate. Anyway, so you can see there was a trial, there was a conviction, and there was a falling out and a determination that Paul was a false apostle. It's recorded in the early church records, but they were suppressed by not being translated for, how many years? It's take the number 1999 and just round it to 2000 and put Ambrose as approximately writing in 350. How many years do you get difference? You'd have to call that 1,650 years of silent suppression of a text that would be very important and critical for all Christians to know about. Wouldn't you think so? Wouldn't you think so? But no, that's not how it was treated. Ambrose said, Erasmus said this maybe was written by a guy who knew how to write like Ambrose. So as to downplay it and maybe, to continue to discourage translation of a work. Why waste our time translating something that maybe wasn't written by Ambrose? There's no evidence given why it shouldn't be regarded as by Bishop Ambrose, which had been accepted for over a millennia as fact. I digress. Okay, next episode, the Ebionite charge against Paul per Epiphanius. So we'll get into some of the specific charges we can find that the Ebion made against Paul. And one of them that was... did I say Epiphanius? The charges that Ebion made, according to Epiphanius, is Panarian. And we'll see what that is next time. And God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.